Welcome to JT Scary Tales. Her parents tortured her for fun. 3 True Horror Stories Animated. Story 1. Sean Bendler Story. I didn't think much of it when Shane invited me over that night. It was supposed to be just another sleepover, a break from homework, siblings, and the usual routine. Her family had always been warm and welcoming. Her mom made dinner, her dad cracked lame dad jokes, and her younger sisters giggled and teased us about boys. The house felt alive, filled with the kind of energy that made it feel safe. But something was off about Shane that night. She kept glancing at her phone during dinner, her fingers twitching, her eyes darting toward the front window every time headlights passed. Finally, upstairs in her room, she whispered, "Sean's coming." I paused, unsure how to respond. I had met her older brother a few times before, and something about him always put me on edge. He was the type of person who could make a room feel 10 degrees colder just by walking into it. His presence was suffocating, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. "Why?" I asked carefully. "He wants money." "Dad's going to say no." "He always does." She didn't have to say the rest. The rumors about Sean were everywhere. People in town said he had a temper, that he was bad news, that when he looked at you, it felt like he was already planning something you wouldn't like. It was after midnight when the sound of tires crunching on gravel made Shane's body go rigid. A car door slammed. Then the front door burst open. "I told you I need IT." Sean's voice thundered through the house, thick with rage. "Not this time." "Sean," her father, Michael, replied, his voice steady but firm. "We're done. You think you can just cut me off? I'm part of this family." Sean roared. I grabbed Shane's arm. "Don't go down there," I whispered, but she was already pulling away. She had to see what was happening. I followed her, peeking from the top of the stairs just as the first gunshot rang out. Michael crumpled instantly, blood pooling around him. Mike, Shane's mother, Sandra, screamed, rushing to his side. "Please, Sean, don't." The second shot hit her in the chest. She collapsed, her body landing awkwardly against the steps before tumbling to the bottom. "Mom!" Shane shrieked. Sean's head snapped up. His face was twisted, dark with something inhuman. He saw her. "Run!" I hissed, yanking her back into her room. We dove under the bed, pressing ourselves against the floor as heavy boots stomped up the stairs. "Where are you, Shane?" Sean's voice sang mockingly. I held my breath as his bloodstained boots stopped just outside the door. A drop of crimson hit the floor, seeping into the carpet like ink spreading on paper. "You think you're better than me?" he snarled. "I'm the one who should be in charge." "Me?" A scream erupted from downstairs. One of Shane's sisters. Then another shot. The house fell silent. The boots returned. The door creaked open. "Where's my little sis?" Sean murmured, stepping inside. From my hiding spot, I saw her, crouched in the closet, the faint glow of her phone screen illuminating her tear-streaked face. "Help us," she sobbed into the phone. "Please." The closet door flew open. Sean grabbed the phone and threw it against the wall, the plastic casing shattering on impact. "Calling the cops?" he sneered. "That's cute. Sean, please." Shane begged, her voice shaking. "You don't have to do this. We're family." He froze. Then he laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. "Family?" he spat. "Then taste the blood of your family." He kicked her in the face. Blood splattered onto the floor. Shane choked, coughing as crimson pooled in her mouth. "Shut up," Sean roared, pressing his boot against her head, slamming it into the floor. I clenched my fists, tears burning my eyes. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stop him. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Sean stepped back, lifted the rifle, and aimed it at her head. "No, please," she shrieked. The shot rang out. Her body slumped to the floor, head twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood spattered the walls. Sean crouched over her, tilting his head like he was admiring his work. Then, silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. When the paramedics pulled me from under the bed hours later, I was still frozen. The blood-stained floor was burned into my mind. The screams still echoed in my ears. I told no one who I was. The evidence was enough to convict him. But every night, I still see her face. I still hear her voice. And I still hear Sean's laughter, cold, endless, and inescapable. The real case. The Sean Bendler murder case occurred in 2006 in Bonaparte, Iowa. 22-year-old Sean Bendler murdered his parents, Michael and Sandra, along with his 3 younger sisters, aged 17, 14, and 12. Bendler shot his family with a rifle in an attempt to inherit the family's wealth and take over their successful grain business. The crime was uncovered when one of the sisters managed to call 911 during the attack, identifying Sean as the killer. He was arrested shortly after and convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder. Bendler was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, leaving a town shattered in his wake. Story 2. Turpin House Horrors. I never knew what was behind the closed doors of that house. None of us did. To the neighbors, the Turpins were just another large, private family. The parents, David and Louise, kept to themselves, and though their 13 children were rarely seen outside, no one asked questions. We assumed they were homeschooling, devout, or just different. But what we didn't know, what none of us could have imagined, was the horror hidden within those walls. It was early morning on January 14, 2018, when a frail, terrified girl staggered onto the street. Her name was Jordan Turpin, 17 years old, but she looked no older than 10. Her clothes were filthy, her hair matted, and her arms bore the scars of years of torment. Clutching a deactivated cell phone, she used it to make the most important call of her life. 911, what's your emergency? Through shaky breaths, Jordan's voice quivered. I just ran away from home. And I live in a house of abuse. The dispatcher pressed for details. Jordan struggled to find the words. She had never spoken to a stranger before. Her entire world had been confined within the walls of her home. A prison masked as a family residence. There's 12 others, my brothers and sisters, she stammered. They're chained up. We don't take baths. We live in filth. Deputies arrived at the Paris, California, home shortly after. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. The beige house sat in a quiet cul-de-sac, adorned with decorative Christmas lights that flickered faintly in the early morning light. But when they knocked on the door, Louise Turpin answered, her face a mask of feigned confusion. Behind her, the stench of rotting garbage and human waste seeped through the threshold. The officers stepped inside, and the nightmare revealed itself. The air was thick with decay. Mold and filth clung to the walls, and the floor was littered with trash. But the real horror lay beyond the living room. Inside the dimly lit bedrooms, they found them, children, ranging from toddlers to adults, pale, skeletal, their wrists and ankles shackled to their beds with heavy chains. Some were so malnourished that their bodies had begun consuming their own muscle for survival. Their eyes, wide with fear, darted toward their parents, as if waiting for permission to speak. But no words came. They had been conditioned into silence. One officer called for bolt cutters. Another called for backup. This was no ordinary case of neglect. This was something far darker. David and Louise Turpin, the very people who were supposed to protect these children, had transformed their own home into a house of horrors. They had systematically starved, beaten, and tormented their kids for years. The siblings later described their existence as a waking nightmare. They were allowed to eat only once a day, a single slice of bread with peanut butter or a frozen burrito. Sometimes gone rancid, they were permitted to bathe once a year. They were denied schooling, medical care, and any knowledge of the outside world. When they defied their parents, they were chained to their beds, left to rot for days or even months. Despite their suffering, they held onto each other. In whispers, they dreamed of escape, of freedom, of a world beyond their prison. Jordan, the bravest among them, had spent 2 years planning her escape, rehearsing every detail in her mind. She had never spoken to a stranger before that night, but she had done the impossible. She had broken free. Within hours, the Turpins were in handcuffs, their twisted empire collapsing around them. The world watched in horror as details emerged, how these parents had manipulated the system, how they had fooled relatives and officials, how they had even taken their children to Disneyland, dressed in matching outfits, smiling for pictures that hid their reality. In court, David and Louise wept, claiming they never meant to hurt their children. But their crimes were undeniable. They were sentenced to life in prison. leaving behind a family shattered but finally free. For the first time, the Turpin children saw sunlight without fear. They took their first real steps into the world, learning what it meant to be human. And though the scars of their past may never fully fade, they now have something they never had before: hope. Jordan's 911 call was more than just a plea for help. It was the first crack in a fortress of horror, a beacon for the voiceless, and proof that even in the darkest of places, there is always a way out. Story 3. Kara Robinson's story. It was a warm afternoon in Columbia, South Carolina, in 2002. 15-year-old Kara Robinson had plans that day. But first, she needed to grab a few things from a friend's house. She didn't think much of it as she stood outside, waiting. The quiet neighborhood felt safe, until it wasn't. A maroon car rolled up to the curb. The driver, a man in his late 30s, smiled through the open window. Something about him made her stomach tighten. But she pushed the feeling aside. Before she could react, he was out of the car, moving fast, a gun pressed into her ribs. "Get in the car, now." She barely had time to scream before he shoved her inside and slammed the door shut. The vehicle sped off, leaving nothing behind but the eerie silence of a suburban street. Kara's heart pounded as she took in the car's interior. Junk littered the floor. A map was crumpled on the dashboard, and the faint smell of sweat and cigarettes filled the air. The man kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes gleaming with something dark and unsettling. "Be a good girl, and you'll live," he said casually, as if they were just going for a drive. She didn't respond. She needed to stay calm, to think. Panicking wouldn't help her now. She focused on every detail: the make of the car, the sticker on the windshield, the scratch on the glove compartment. If she got out of this, she would remember everything. Hours passed. The car pulled up to a small, dingy apartment. He dragged her inside, locking the door behind them. The place was a mess: fast food containers, unwashed clothes, and something far more chilling: a collection of newspaper clippings about missing girls. Kara swallowed hard. She knew she wasn't his first. The man, Richard Ivanitz, had a routine. He tied her up, gagged her, and forced her to stay in the bathtub. He would leave, then return, always making sure she knew he was in control. But Kara had something he didn't expect: patience. She memorized the layout of the apartment, noted where he kept his belongings, and most importantly, she never stopped thinking about escape. As night fell, he became careless, convinced she was too scared to fight back. He laid down on the bed, dozing off, the sound of his heavy breathing filling the room. Kara knew this was her moment. Slowly, she wiggled her hands free from the restraints. Every movement felt like an eternity. She eased out of the bathtub, her bare feet barely making a sound against the grimy floor. Her eyes darted to the door, locked. Then she spotted it: his gun, resting on the nightstand just inches away from his sleeping form. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, her heartbeat drowning out every other sound. If he woke up now, it would be over. But he didn't. She grabbed the gun, clutching it tightly in her hands. She ran, fumbling with the lock. She yanked the door open and bolted outside, the cool night air stinging her skin. She didn't look back. She didn't stop. She sprinted to the nearest road, waving frantically at a passing car. The driver, a woman in her 40s, slammed on the brakes. One look at Kara's terrified face, and she threw the door open. "Help me," Kara gasped. "Please." Minutes later, police swarmed the area. Kara recounted everything: his name, his car, his apartment. She hadn't just escaped, she had given them everything they needed to find him. The hunt for Richard Ivanitz began immediately. He had done this before. Kara's bravery uncovered a monster. He was responsible for the abductions and murders of 3 other young girls. Days later, authorities tracked him down in Florida. Cornered, knowing there was no escape, Ivanitz ended his own life before he could be arrested. Kara's nightmare was over, but her courage ensured that no other girl would fall victim to him. She was no longer just a survivor, she was the reason justice was served. Do you love spine-chilling stories and eerie mysteries? You've come to the right place. At JT Scary Tales, we bring you the most terrifying and thrilling scary tales from around the world. From haunted places to unexplained phenomena, our scary tales will keep you on the edge of your seat. Subscribe now and dive into the dark world of scary tales.